Well, hello, church. I'm so grateful to be able to share with you today in this sermon, and also to thank my colleagues for all of the reflections that they've offered. Probably the first time ever in our career that we can remember hearing from an entire district staff about their reflections of what's been happening in a really difficult time. And so I'm privileged to be able to share with you today a little bit in a sermon, and we'll try to have you out of here, somewhere between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. You'll all be Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, was asked this question one day: when did civilization begin? And she reared back because, she was taking questions at a lecture. And she thought about it for a moment, and this is her response. Civilization began when someone broke their femur, and then another human came alongside of them to care for them, to bring them to a place of healing, to bind it up, to rudimentally cast it and immobilize it, and then bring them food, protect them from wild animals, and nurse them back to health. She said that's when civilization began. Friends, we feel like that civilization is being shaken right now. In the midst of a season where we are living in the middle of two pandemics. One pandemic we've been living with for 400 years. Another pandemic has come to us recently in the form of the novel coronavirus. But racism, the pandemic that we've lived with for such a long time, and this pandemic of the coronavirus known as COVID-19, call us to think seriously about how it is that we're going to care for each other and be deeply engaged with each other. I've been so proud of our churches and our pastors, our congregations, who have waited patiently but have offered hope in the midst of this particular season that we've lived in. Some people have gone and created marches in their communities. Some people have created robust food insecurity programs, working out of their food pantries that have already existed in the church, but because of social distancing, took the food pantry out into the community and fed people. There are persons who have been deeply engaged in child care and reaching out to first responders and assuaging the pain and deep angst that many people feel. In the season that I've been at home working on your behalf as your district superintendent, I've been feeling a lot of those things too. I've experienced the deep cry of persons to reopen the economy. And then I dove deep into the words of Jesus, who said that human beings do not live by the economy alone. And I've heard from the deep words of Jesus that reminds us that human beings were created to be engaged deeply in community and to assuage pain and the deep angst. To be the one who reaches out, who would even dare to offer a cup of cold water. I'm privileged to work with lots of people who are deeply engaged in food insecurity, in particular for children. And it makes me very proud to know that people are standing up and they're being counted. But they're standing up because they count on those that they're in a relationship with. They see deep pain. They see deep angst. They are healing the femur of their brother and their sister, to use Margaret Mead now as a metaphor. This is the church being the church. 4 months ago, we could make the claim that some of our churches have been spending more time looking at themselves than they've been looking outward at their community. But all of a sudden, things have changed. We're being called to new ways of living and to be deeply engaged. and we're doing that. But let me just mention one more. We're coming to you today by Facebook Live. So many have reported that hundreds of new people have been coming to congregations, searching and experiencing, looking for, questioning what it means to really be a follower of Jesus. What does it really mean to be a follower of the way? What does it mean to be deeply engaged in community that's caring for more than just itself? And you're rising to that occasion. You're telling that story. You're helping people understand that. The passage that's been read throughout this afternoon comes from the book of Romans, and it's quite likely that the Apostle Paul is under house arrest as he's writing this letter to the church. I don't know what was going through his mind, if he was feeling the angst of incarceration in his own life, or feeling the angst of the potential of impending death. But I wonder if Paul's words could be helpful to us today, not only in thinking about how it is that we have waited patiently in hope, but also how some of that could be addressed by his words, about how he can minister to us and change our lives. Because what Paul is offering is a transformational relationship with Jesus, not a transactional relationship.
That's right.
And I think that we've rediscovered this in the life of the church. Paul is offering us a word about the experience that many of us have had in the midst of this season. At least I believe he is. Maybe you should check my exegetical work. Maybe you might even want to hold me to account in thinking about this. But I think that what Paul is talking about in this particular book and to the particular people in Rome is about trauma. You know, the reason that I come up with that is because Paul is offering all sorts of ways for us to be more deeply engaged with each other. The passage that was already spoken, we do not know how to pray as we ought, with words too deep for sighing, invites us to think about how it is that we can offer our whole selves, because far too often we've created ourselves in such a way that it is God that is subservient to us rather than us serving in obedience to God. Too often we've fallen into clubism and elitism. We've walled ourselves off from our neighbors. We have taken our baptismal vows and we've set them aside because it makes us just a little too uncomfortable. But I invite you to step into that discomfort, to step into the ways that we can be deeply engaged in the midst of these two pandemics. No culture would know what it means to engage in the traumatization of people than the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire came across cultures and socially dislocated people. It moved people from one place to another. It held people in horrible conditions. It created a capital punishment program that we call the crucifixion, which is state-sponsored terrorism as a way to hold the people down. And as already has been said, even though Christ was the recipient of that, he rose from the dead and changed everything. In the midst of this, we find ourselves in this season thinking about the culture that we have created. The COVID-19 experience has cut across our culture in incredible ways, but in ways that we've not fully appreciated yet. The people that have been most hurt have been persons of color, the elderly, the poor, the disconnected, the homeless, those who have no status in our country. And yet, we have been crying out for the restoration of the economy. Everyone needs to work. Everyone needs to provide for their family. But we need to think about how it is that we can hold those pieces in tension so that it holds the deep ethics of who we are as followers of Jesus Christ. Not at the expense of anyone, but in the way that we can include others to be a part of the community. In my own life, I've struggled deeply with race. I've struggled deeply with culture. And in those deep times of reflection, I found myself having to even engage in my own sensibility. Because sometimes the culture just speaks a little bit louder than faith even speaks. It says, Todd, do this, say this. Todd, do this, say this. And when you keep hearing that drumbeat, even though you know what you're engaged in and what you're doing is inappropriate and incorrect and maybe even sinful, that culture speaks. Todd, do this, say this, stay away from here, don't engage with these people, do this, say this. And it becomes a cacophony that keeps us from becoming the beloved community that God has created us to be. Just a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated Pentecost. A multicultural event where everyone heard in their own language. There was no monoculture that was created on the other side of Pentecost, but rather it was the celebration of all this incredible diversity. How is it then that in our own culture, we've allowed all that diversity to become separatism? Whereas some scholars have said 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in our culture. How did we take the glory and the excitement of Pentecost and turn it into, well, you can fill in the blank. As I got a little older and discovered that some of my fear of engaging in conversation with persons who are different than I am came out of my own embarrassment of being afraid of saying the wrong thing, out of my own embarrassment of knowing that people have been treated badly, even though I had never really treated anyone bad. I've inherited that which has been done to others. And then, of course, that culture just keeps speaking loudly, do this, say that. Do this, say that. Don't engage here, don't do this, say that. And it's easy to fall into it. A couple of years ago, I was asked to engage in a cultural competency program, which was transformational for me. It was the answer to lots of questions that I've been able to ask over my adult life about how I relate with others. In the midst of it, I learned that there are 5 levels of cultural competency: denial, polarization, minimization, acceptance, and adaptability. I'm wondering if in this text, that in Paul's words to the church that is in Rome, if he is moving people towards an experience of acceptance and an experience of adaptation in their lives by offering their lives, their whole selves, not just the part that we want Jesus to see, but our whole selves to Jesus. We are saved by grace. We are justified by grace. Hallmarks of the theology of our church and of Protestantism that comes from this book of Romans. It fills us up, it changes us, it offers us an opportunity to think more deeply about how it is that we have been traumatized by our history and how we have traumatized others because we allow the culture to speak too loudly into our ears instead of letting the Spirit blow through us and fill our nostrils and fill our lungs so that we may speak out on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves. This is hard work. It's been hard work. Thinking about it, thinking about my complicity and silence, thinking about how it is that I've allowed the culture to speak louder than my faith in Jesus Christ. It's embarrassing. I mean, I've been to seminary. I've been to church camp. I've been to the altar of prayer in my church, and yet still can miss it over and over again. Now, I'm not out to make anyone feel bad, because I'm not interested in making anyone feel bad. But what I am interested in is in paying attention to those who are around us. We sent out a letter this week, inviting people to think of creative ways to be deeply engaged in ending racist behaviors in our culture and in our community. I've been overwhelmed by the responses of people, the things that they're willing to commit to do and to be engaged in, and to be deeply transformed and to deeply transform. Yesterday, you received a devotion from me from Howard Thurman, where Howard Thurman, the great theologian, the great pastor, the great leader, the great voice, who offers words of hope in the midst of difficult times, offered a word of his own confession as a way to enter into deeper relationships with persons. And so I hope and pray that you might offer a confession to think about how you could more deeply engage in relationships with persons who might be different than you are. An opportunity for us to work together. I've learned in the work of being a cultural coach, and I've learned in being a pastor for 31 years, that if trauma is not dealt with, if someone can't come alongside of the traumatized person and help them walk through a season of healing, the trauma that is not transformed is always trauma that's transferred. It comes out in unhelpful ways. It comes out when you least suspect that it will come out. And it destroys relationships, and it kills human community. It's not easy work to live in the midst of two pandemics. But Jesus has promised to be with us always. And that gives me hope. That reminds me of all that's really important to grasp hold of. And it gives me the reason why I'm engaged in the things that I'm engaged in. It's my privilege to be your superintendent. It's my privilege to see all that you are doing to reach out in concern and service to your communities. To share the good news with all who will hear. But also to come alongside and walk along someone and share this good gift of life that we have together. For it's in the name of the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sustainer that I pray.